difficult choices are having to be made in terms of the budget. Pensions, social stipends to war invalids and pensions for soldiers, etc., are somewhat constrained, right? So Putin has to think about this. The longer the war goes on, the more casualties, the more disgruntled soldiers coming home, the more challenging domestic economic conditions, the more likelihood of domestic social and political unrest. We saw that, just over a year ago with the Prigozhin-Wagner mutiny, came from nowhere. Putin cannot discount that. It seems kind of unlikely at this point in time, but no one expected the Prigozhin-Wagner mutiny. It came from nowhere. So I think even he will have to, it'll be at the back of his mind that he's not invulnerable, and a long war has risks for Putin.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by the economist Tim Ash, an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House, and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. Tim, welcome.
My pleasure to be here.
Russia has come into 2025 in a perhaps resurgent position on the battlefield, but does this mask some turbulence at home? Last month, the Russian central bank upheld its 21% interest rate, and Putin's war-focused economy seems to be struggling with this 9.5% inflation. What does that mean for the Kremlin and the wider Russian economy?
Well, Russia came into the war with a lot of resources, a lot of buffers. Putin knew he was going to invade. I think he was the only person who knew that. They had a big buffer of foreign exchange reserves. West imposed sanctions because of the invasion, obviously. Some of those resources those buffers have now been worn down. Later last year, we saw a tightening of sanctions, actually, secondary sanctions. Some key foreign exchange bureaus, brokerages were closed down. Tighter sanctions on some of the Russian oil sector. And that fed through to weakening of the ruble, passed through to inflation, and difficult choices for Russian policymakers. So the buffers have been worn down. It means that more difficult choices are having to be made by Russia's economic policy elite. Higher inflation, likely lower growth, and disappearing buffers like foreign exchange reserves, right? So finally, I think the impacts of sanctions and the war are beginning to have an economic effect on Russia.
And we were talking about the battlefield for a moment there. Replacing Putin's troop losses in Ukraine is having quite a damaging effect on the Russian workforce and inflation as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a classic guns versus butter dilemma, right? I mean, if those buffers I mentioned, those foreign exchange reserves have been eroded by sanctions, Russia still wants to maintain its military output, so it has to divert resources away from consumption to military production. At the same time, probably Russia's overall losses, if you take dead and injured and people who've returned from the conflict, probably around 1 million soldiers are probably out of or 1 million people are out of the workforce. Russia already had a difficult demographic kind of backdrop, aging population. So pretty tight labour markets, labour shortages means wage pressure. Those in work do well, you get higher wages. If you're not in work, you're impacted by higher inflation. So I think more of the population are beginning to see an impact. Key consumer goods, eggs, milk, bread, all these kind of things are going up in price. The BBC correspondent actually over the last couple of weeks interviewed loads of people on the streets of Moscow and other cities, and they increasingly expressed frustration at the long war, and they're beginning to get worn down a bit by it, and obviously there is an impact in terms of their own consumer basket, yeah.
And of course, none of that's been helped by the Russian ruble, which is at its lowest value, I think, since the start of the war at this point. How damaging is that for Putin's war economy?
Well, currency weakness is never a reflection of a strong economy. It reflects vulnerabilities, weaknesses, deteriorating balance of payments, trade position. Strong countries, politicians like Putin, hate that. So I think if of everything, the weak ruble is a sign of the economic difficulties. And the consequences of that are higher inflation, import prices. Imports cost more. That passes through eventually to products on the shelves. As you mentioned, the central bank, it has had to raise interest rates. Okay, not in the last meeting, but rates at 21%. The assumption is that rates will have to go higher. Higher policy rates from a central bank ultimately mean lower growth. So the consequences of all that, the war in effect and sanctions, is kind of stagflation in Russia. Lower growth, higher inflation than would have been otherwise the case had the invasion not happened.
And what does that mean for Putin and the Kremlin? I mean, is this going to now start to have a real impact on their popularity and the popularity of his invasion of Ukraine?
Okay, it's one data point in a host of things that I think Putin will have to consider. You mentioned that Russia seems to be making some progress on the front line. It's very slow moving. Ukraine is a huge country. Putin still has less than 20% of the overall country. It's unlikely that Ukrainian front lines will collapse. The attrition rate in terms of Russian soldiers dead, injured, has been pretty enormous. Though, as I said, those people are coming home. They cannot be greatly enthused by 3 years of war, and actually, difficult choices are having to be made in terms of the budget. Pensions, social stipends to war invalids and pensions for soldiers, etc., are somewhat constrained, right? So Putin has to think about this. The longer the war goes on, the more casualties, the more disgruntled soldiers coming home, the more challenging domestic economic conditions, the more likelihood of domestic social and political unrest. We saw that, just over a year ago with the Prigozhin-Wagner mutiny, came from nowhere. Putin cannot discount that. It seems kind of unlikely at this point in time, but no one expected the Prigozhin-Wagner mutiny. It came from nowhere. So I think even he will have to, it'll be at the back of his mind that he's not invulnerable, and a long war has risks for Putin.
And so you mentioned before Western sanctions and their impact. Further west, then, is it carry on that track, or is now the opportunity to tighten the screws on the Kremlin?
Well, obviously the US election has been pretty important therein. I mean, the Biden administration, interestingly, in the last 6 months have significantly tightened sanctions. I think that is one of the reasons the ruble has more recently pushed much lower. We've seen a really aggressive sanctions on the energy sector. Some, in fact, were announced earlier today on Russia's shadow fleets, on various Russian oil industry enterprises. There's some uncertainty whether those sanctions will remain in place under Trump. Obviously, Trump has his own views around Russia and the war in Ukraine. But I guess those sanctions give Trump some leverage, right? I mean, he can go into negotiations with Putin. He can say, well, I might not impose the latest sanctions imposed by Biden. I may take them off. But I want something in exchange. I want something from Putin, right? They give some leverage. We don't really know what Trump is going to do. I mean, he said, 6 months, a year ago, he would end the war before he took office, and then in 24 hours. He's backtracked a bit. Most recently, he said he's aiming to get the war ended in kind of 6 months. We're not sure what the plan is. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of concern in Ukraine that it's selling Ukraine down the river to Putin because Trump has some special relationship Trump has some special relationship with Putin. We simply do not know what Trump is going to do. And that creates, obviously, risks for Ukraine, risks for Europe. Can Ukraine survive without US support? I think financially, Europe can fill the void. The question mark is really around military supplies. I mean, the US is still the superpower within NATO. It is still the main supplier of military equipment to the Ukrainians. If Trump says no more weapons, how long can the Ukraine survive in that scenario? Even if Europe continues to write checks, I mean, in that scenario, would Trump be still willing to sell US weapons to Europe for Ukraine? Or would he just cut them off completely? And I guess the question is, in a worst case scenario for Ukraine, where Trump cuts everything off, how long are the Ukrainians willing to fight? Big question mark, right? And what are the consequences? Actually, interesting for Europe. what are the consequences of a potential Ukrainian defeat? What does that mean for Europe?
And I definitely want to come on to Trump. I mean, it is the elephant in the room, really, at the moment. But it is worth mentioning, of course, that Kiev is having its own pretty significant manpower problems. Uh, what is the state of the Ukrainian economy as well going into 2025? Where do they sit right now? Or is this all just relying on whether or not there are negotiations?
Well, there's been a lot of durability. I mean, the resilience of the Ukrainian economy has been pretty remarkable. Until very recently, it was growing at a higher pace than Russia, and inflation was lower. It's been remarkable that despite a huge invasion and an ongoing war, the banks have continued to function. The currency has worked. The railways work better than in the UK. Telecommunications work. It's functioned pretty well, and the reason one of the reasons, well, various reasons, but there was a lot of reforms instigated in Ukraine on the macro level, reform of the central bank, reform of the banking system from around 2015. Ukraine has a very competent crew of technocrats running the macro story, and at the same time, it has received very substantial macro financial assistance from the West. It's about $100 billion a year in total. Of that, about $40 billion has been budget and balance of payment support. So that's helped keep the currency stable, acted as a cap on inflation, and it's kept the economy kind of purring away. That money's been used to pay civil servants' wages, teachers, doctors, healthcare workers, and soldiers. Right. So the economy's performed remarkably well. One might have assumed at the outset of the war, one of the consequences would be currency collapse, hyperinflation, collapse of the banking system. And we've seen those in the past in Ukraine, but not this time around. So it's been very durable. But, if military supplies, particularly from the US, stopped and Ukraine began to suffer, larger territorial losses in the east, I think we would begin to see a cracking of that macro stability. Obviously, there's concern in a worsened macroeconomic environment for Ukraine. Would we see increased outmigration? Increased outmigration would obviously create tight labour markets, labour shortages, and more problems in terms of manpower on the front line. Obviously, it would also create lots of additional problems in Europe. Obviously, we're grappling with migration issues, anti-immigration sentiment, rise of populism, and more Ukrainians moving west, I think would just accentuate those kind of political problems in Europe.
So let's come on to Donald Trump then, and the possibility of a peace deal or some sort of negotiated settlement. Trump has said in the last few days that a meeting is being set up with Putin. But is that going to be a silver bullet for the Russian economy? And what does it mean for Ukraine?
Well, again, we do not know exactly what is in Trump's mind on this. Does he care about Ukraine? Does he understand about the importance of Ukraine for European security? Does he just want to give Putin whatever he wants and go away and focus on China or Greenland or Panama or Canada? We simply don't know. But what is really self-evident now is what happens in Ukraine is absolutely critical for European security. Just going back to what I said earlier, if US military support for Ukraine is massively reduced, Ukraine might well suffer significant and catastrophic defeat on the Eastern Front. Putin would take advantage of that. Can we imagine a scenario where the whole of Ukraine or a much more significant part of Ukraine falls under Russian control? That again, going back, that would mean tens of millions of Ukrainians would move west. Again, I've raised the political and social and economic challenges for Europe that would suggest. Ukraine now has a huge military-industrial complex. Right, it's invested massively in building up its military industries. It's done really well in some innovation related to drones. It's probably got the number 2 military-industrial complex in Europe. Now, if you add that to Russia, which has done the same, Ukraine plus Russia combined would be a huge military machine that would there would be a risk of further Russian enlargement beyond Ukraine. And what can Europe do? What would Europe do with a US that is disengaged from Europe? Massive security threats to Europe. I would suggest that Europe will have to invest massively in its own defense. Interestingly, Trump only in the last week or so suggested that NATO defense spending should go up to 5% of GDP. Many countries have struggled to get to 2%. UK's planning to get to 2.5%. There's been some, NATO Secretary General has suggested 3%. But, Russia will be a perennial threat to Europe if Ukraine, well, it is already, it will be even more so if it defeats Ukraine. It will be right up close and personal on our front, on NATO's borders. Do we trust Putin not to go further? I don't think we can, given his track record, right? So, it's a massive problem for Europe. Europe has to do whatever it can to make sure that Ukraine is able to hold the line. It is secure. It will be trying to push Trump in the negotiations to ensure Ukraine's security. Now, the key to this peace deal is this idea of Ukraine's security, right? Ukraine has a decent economic outlook if it's secure and it's put in a position where Russia doesn't invade again. Talk about NATO membership, talk about bilateral security guarantees from European countries. Seems kind of unlikely at this stage, those kind of things. But, what is critical is that Ukraine gets the military kit to be able to defend itself. It's proven Ukrainians have proven more than able to fight. We failed them in terms of supplying the kit in a timely manner to halt Russia. I mean, that's been the key problem. We've been the key problem. The Western Alliance have failed to live up to our promises to the Ukrainians. So, the key in these peace talks is, assuring security for Ukraine, however we decide to do that. Otherwise, if Ukraine is not secure, the risk is that we see political and social instability in Ukraine that Putin will exploit to invade again.
And while Trump is in office and while he's trying to figure out whatever peace deal, as he would like to see it, will come to look like, can Ukraine rely, at least in the short term, on Europe to provide more of that strategic leadership and financial aid as well?
Well, one plus, I guess, is in anticipation of a Trump presidency, there's been a lot of front loading of financial and actually military assistance to Ukraine, right? So there's been a $50 billion facility provided from the interest stream on frozen Russian assets. The EU has a €50 billion macro financial assistance program for Ukraine. There's various assistance provided by the UK, Norway, Canada, Japan, etc. Ukraine has about $46 billion in foreign exchange reserves. So it has the cash to survive at least a year. I'd say on the military front, in terms of munitions, it probably has enough to sustain itself for perhaps as much as 6 months. But ultimately, I think if Trump decides to stop or significantly slow the flow of munitions, beyond that 6-month period, things get quite difficult for the Ukrainians. Now, the question is, if Trump is pushing a bad deal on Ukrainians, would Zelensky feel willing and able to reject that and try and fight on? Big question mark. I mean, the problem is a bad deal that doesn't ensure Ukraine's security is not going to be sustainable. Putin will inevitably use a weak deal, as we saw, I guess, with Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, if you go back to 2014, 2015. He'll use that as an opportunity to go in again. I mean, we absolutely know that. I mean, interesting, you asked me the question, I guess what happens to sanctions and the relationship with the West if there's a peace deal? I would say that whatever happens now between Trump and Putin in this peace process, I think it's crystal clear to Europe that Russia is a long-term existential threat to its security. Look at the messaging coming out of our leaders: Starmer, Macron, Rutte, the NATO Secretary General. I think it's absolutely crystal clear that Russia and Putin are bad actors. They don't like us. They hate our systems of governance. They want to undermine and destabilize us. Even if Putin gets what he wants in Ukraine, he will want more. That's the type of character he is. We should know from history in terms of dictators, whether you look at Hitler or Stalin, you go down the list. You show weakness. You give them what they want more. Putin only respects power and strength. We have to, I think, be pretty resilient in our defence, I think.
We often, imagine that Trump will simply be bad for the Ukrainians, good for Russia. But could a Trump economy, led global economy, in fact, be damaging for Putin? I think you've previously mentioned yourself on Frontline that Trump's desire to increase US oil production could drop the price of oil, which could harm the Russian economy. Is there anything that Putin's going to be looking out for under a Trump economy, that a Trump administration that could be damaging for the Kremlin?
Well, I mean, the irony perhaps is that a peace deal that eased sanctions on Russia, combined with Trump's agenda clearly to pump more oil and deregulate, it could crash global oil prices again, as you've mentioned, which would be pretty catastrophic for the Russian economy. Something like 40% of export receipts and government receipts are oil and energy related, right? So that would be pretty devastating on Putin. I mean, Trump has lots of leverage over Putin, right? He has lots of levers he can pull. He has the ability to dial up military support for Ukraine. He could provide them with more weapons. Remember, no US troops are on the line in Ukraine. There are no boots on the ground. No Americans are dying in Ukraine defending Western security and European security. And actually, in many respects, the more weapons that Trump supplies to Ukraine, a lot of that is really good for the US military industrial complex and for the US economy. Trump has the ability to massively increase sanctions if he wants to. And remember here, we started off talking about the Russian economy, and I still don't think a long war necessarily is good for Putin. It comes with risks, right? So I think you have a situation where Putin would rather like a settlement at this point in time, or at least a break in the war, a ceasefire, either a deal that gives him everything he wants, or a deal that leaves Ukraine insecure and gives him the option to intervene again in the future. But I think Putin wants a peace deal more than Trump. I'm not sure Trump really recognizes that, and I'm not sure Trump really understands that he has all the cards over Putin. I mean, it was a bit worrying this week that what we've seen is Trump concede already some of those ace cards he had. What should be up for negotiation is whether or not Ukraine joins NATO. Ukraine wants to join NATO. Russia doesn't want it to join. But already Trump declared this week there is no NATO membership for Ukraine. I mean, that's an incredible give from Trump before negotiations even began. Also, he mentioned no long-range missiles for Ukraine. Ukraine's been put at a huge disadvantage in recent years by the fact that the Biden administration and Scholz in Germany have basically red-carded the use of long-range Western weapons into Russia. Russia is using long-range weapons against Ukraine to a devastating effect. The fact that Ukraine couldn't hit back has left them very, very vulnerable. It's meant that they've not been able to hit Russian supply chains. Russia has moved them further back to put beyond reach of Ukrainian long-range weapons. But Trump has said he's not going to do that. So again, it's one of his NATO membership, use of long-range weapons. He's already pulled that off the agenda. I mean, this doesn't look like a person who really understands the issues and problems in Ukraine. It doesn't seem like he really understands what a strong negotiating position he is in and what a weak position Putin is in. And I think the Ukrainians must be quite fearful that in the end, Trump is going to give Putin everything he wants. In fact, interestingly, also in terms of what's already been conceded, Kellogg General Kellogg, who's been anointed as Trump's chief negotiator for Ukraine, already wrote a piece over the summer suggesting that Russia gets what it de facto controls in terms of territory on the ground. Again, this was something that could have been negotiated. So Trump and his colleagues are rapidly giving away most of their negotiating points, which again leaves Ukraine rather vulnerable.
Is there something more that Europe could do then, in terms of, as some people have called it, Trump-proofing Ukraine? One thing this week on Monday, UK members of Parliament debated whether the UK should hand over $300 billion of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. That's obviously a long-running debate. Are we likely to see any further movement in that direction?
Well, there's been a long, painful discussion on that issue since the invasion, actually. In the $330 billion of Central Bank of Russia assets, that's Russian taxpayers' money, was immobilized in Western jurisdictions within months of the full-scale invasion. So the last 2 years we've been debating, whether or not that money should be given to Ukraine for recovery and reconstruction to fund its own defense. We've seen a lot of blocking tactics by vested interests, particularly in Europe, by the ECB, by the German government, Italian government, and the Belgian government. They seem to prefer a scenario where their own taxpayers pay for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction and also are used to pay for Ukraine's defense. I think that's indefensible. We should be making Russia pay. We should be taking that money, giving it to the Ukrainians so they have a war chest that they can actually buy their own weapons to defend themselves. And imagine a scenario, I think it would be very difficult for President Trump, who wants to make America great again and is very focused on American jobs and spurring, the recovery and of the US economy. I mean, imagine if President Zelensky had $330 billion of cash sat in his bank account and he knocked on Trump's door and said, I'd rather like to buy 100 F-16s or 50 F-35s or whatever you have to offer. I don't think Trump could say no in that scenario. So I think it's a disgrace, actually, that our politicians have not done this already. It's easy to do legally. It's a political decision. And, those UK politicians or parliamentarians who are pushing this, I commend them. And the UK government needs to get behind it. One of the problems is, of the $330 billion, 2/3 is in the EU jurisdictions. So we have a relatively small amount in the UK. It's about $20 billion or something like that. Well, $20 billion around that amount. It would be good if the UK government unilaterally did that, but far better if we did it with our allies. And again, I mean, it would Trump-proof Ukraine's financing its defences. Unfortunately, it's probably a bit too late in that regard. We're like a week and a half or so away from a Trump administration. We're not sure what the Trump administration's views on it are. But as I said, it's a shame that it hasn't happened already and Ukraine's not got those resources so it could buy its own defence equipment.
So from the position that Putin and the Kremlin are in now, do you think Putin is going to be feeling pretty confident at this point in his aims and objectives and where Russia is economically at the moment?
Well, again, a lot depends on this actual negotiation. Does Putin think he can get one over on Trump? Does Putin? I mean, clear Putin cares about Ukraine more than Trump. Does Trump really understand all the issues? I don't think so. Does he care enough about Europe? Does he understand Ukraine is central for European security? Not really. Putin must feel fairly confident going into negotiations that he can pull one over on Trump. I guess the only modicum of ease, perhaps, for the Ukrainians is that Trump, sells this line that is a genius negotiator, right? Is the art of the deal. As I said, Trump has all the cards. If he screws up this negotiation and the end result is a collapse of Ukraine akin to what happened in Afghanistan, the implications for Europe will be devastating, and that will be all on Trump's watch. Trump would get all the the negative commentary around this. You know, how the hell could this guy screw up these negotiations when he had all the cards in his hands? When, as I said, Putin, I think, wants a deal, but he's seeing a scenario where he can get everything he wants, right? And it's difficult. You know, I mean, there's a scenario where Ukraine could totally be sold down the river here.
Timothy Ash, thank you very much for joining Frontline today.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.